Our other top story tonight, news about a controversial news executive moving into the White House. Trump tapping former Fox News executive and Roger Ailes' ally, Bill Shine, to be the new deputy chief of staff. Many politicos talk about how Trump, who spent his life as a Manhattan media personality and an apparent Democrat, had taken over the Republican Party in 2016. Now, he did that by squaring off against and ultimately co-opting the GOP's most powerful megaphone, Fox News, famously battling then Fox anchor Megyn Kelly. He was also willing to clash with Roger Ailes and Rupert Murdoch, something that actually scared most establishment Republicans. We know, of course, that Trump triumphed. 2016 began with Fox as a kingmaker, but ended with Roger Ailes out, and he was advising Trump's campaign and Trump commanding loyalty at that channel. And Donald Trump knows transactional relationships. He went on to hire or talk about hiring numerous Fox personalities. And some of those whom Trump has not hired are actually the most influential. Consider Sean Hannity, often called a shadow chief of staff, who first recommended this news tonight, first pushing the hiring of Bill Shine, Hannity even arranging private meetings for them at Mar-a-Lago. And then he used his own show to push this idea forward.
Ex-Fox News boss Bill Shine in talks to become White House communications director. If that's true, I think it would be great because he's great at his job. And he's one of the smartest people I've ever known and one of the nicest people I've ever known. As far as what I know about it, it's if I did know anything, it's none of your business anyway.
What? It's none of your business. That's Sean Hannity telling his own audience that his inside information isn't theirs to hear, a confession that he will literally keep secrets for his political allies out of an apparent loyalty against the interests of his audience, just like he kept it a secret that he was retaining Trump lawyer Michael Cohen as his own lawyer. Now, Shine clearly in better graces with Trump than Michael Cohen tonight, even though the hire is also controversial given significant criticism that Bill Shine did not do enough to address sexual harassment claims against Fox hosts, issues that led to the ousting of Bill O'Reilly, Roger Ailes, and then Shine himself. Now, we're going to cover this from a couple important angles. First, I'm joined by MSNBC contributor Sam Seder and Chicago Tribune columnist Clarence Page to look at the politics. Sam, why does it matter if a president is hiring an executive like this?
Well, I mean, aside from his record in terms of dealing with sexual harassment.
Right, which we'll get to in a moment.
The relationship that he's had with Fox and the way that Fox has been responding. I mean, look, Tony Snow came and worked for the Bush administration, but there was some daylight between Fox and the Bush administration at that time. They were more focused on Republicans, but in this instance, it seems like the entire network is there to push Donald Trump's line and perspective. And I mean, frankly, it's disturbing, too, because, you know, Sean Hannity, the second most powerful guy in the country, we're not talking exactly like a brain trust here. And so I think, you know, what we have is Donald Trump increasingly speaking only to his base and creating a second sort of narrative of what has been going on. If you watch Fox for a day, you will hear none of what the rest of the world essentially is reporting about the Trump administration.
Clarence, building on Sam's points and given your role as a student of American politics, there's an argument that this television goes... Say again?
And television.
And television. Well, and we're on television right now. If you want to get into it.
I used to work at CBS there, right?
There's a larger argument, right, that the blurring between the campaign season and the governing season predates Donald Trump. Famous books like The Permanent Campaign argue that. But Donald Trump has played it forward to the degree that in the hiring of Bill Shine and all these other people from Fox, it's almost like the lack of interest in governing has dropped to zero, and the interest in content is somewhere near 100% of his focus. Do you view that as part of why this is different or worse?
Well, I view this as a continuation of something you touched on a moment ago, and that is that Donald Trump is not just the TV president. He is a medium in himself. He has enough clout there at Fox now. The relationship is so close that they instruct him as far as information goes, and he instructs them at the same time. This is similar to what Masha Gessen, famous Russian journalist who has written a lot about Vladimir Putin, points out that people thought Putin wanted to control the Russian press, and he wound up controlling major Russian media in less than 2 years. And this is what Donald Trump is following, the model of, the media is our enemy, except for those who we have an association with, in other words, our medium, and that's Fox News. It's really that close of a relationship.
Well, and you hit that point is very important, because you're talking not just about battling the press, which has been going on since the founding. That's why it was the First Amendment. There was an awareness that this would happen. But you're talking about something much more theocratic or authoritarian, which is trying to actually replace the entire press, or the part of the press that's most heard. Take a listen on that point to Donald Trump in one of his bromance interviews, if you want to call it that, with Hannity.
I will say this. You have been so great, and I'm very proud of you. And, you know, I'm a ratings person. You notice I always talk. Okay. Has anyone seen his rating? I'm very proud of you, and it's an honor to be on your show. I have to tell you that, Joe.
Clarence.
Well, it's an honor for him to be on Hannity's show on Trump's network. I mean, there's that close of a relationship. And both sides benefit. Fox and Trump both benefit from this close relationship with the exclusive stories. That's kind of part of Sean's snarky reference to, you know, none of your business. I've got my secrets, ha, ha, ha. But the fact is that they are very close in terms of setting policy as well as setting the public image. Trump, one of the great legends, one of the great myths is that Donald Trump hates the media. As we've seen, he loves the media that he can manipulate, and he only hates it when we don't cooperate in the way that he would like. So it's going to be interesting to see how effective Bill Shine is in helping to implement that.
Well, he loves the media because he loves attention and content. What he hates is journalism, because by his own standing, by his own statements, he doesn't believe in public accountability. Clarence Page, thank you for joining this part of the conversation. Sam, stay with me, because we want to turn to the other thing that is as big a deal, Shine's history at Fox. Now, he stepped down from the big title of co-president amid these accusations that he'd been enabling alleged sexual misconduct by others at the network. He was named in multiple lawsuits and allegations related to both sexual harassment and racial discrimination allegations at Fox. Now, Shine denies these allegations. NBC's Megyn Kelly, who of course was previously there, has said specifically that she tried to complain to Shine about Bill O'Reilly's alleged misconduct.
O'Reilly's suggestion that no one ever complained about his behavior is false. I know because I complained. Bill Shine called me in response to my email promising to deal with O'Reilly. By 8 p.m. that night, O'Reilly had apparently been dealt with. And by that I mean he was permitted, with management's advance notice and blessing, to go on the air and attack the company's harassment victims yet again.
For more on this, I'm joined by New York Times investigative reporter Megan Twohey. She's part of the team at the Times investigating many of these stories. Spent 4 months working on exposing Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein. When you look at that part of this, put aside the political debate over how White Houses communicate, what does it tell you that today this is the person being hired by U.S. tax dollars at the White House to take on such a big role?
I think there's significant symbolism here. I mean, the past year has seen this Me Too movement take off, where powerful men have been held accountable for sexual misconduct. Bill O'Reilly, Roger Ailes, Harvey Weinstein. And you know, it's worth noting that Trump himself faces more than 10 allegations of sexual misconduct. And while other people have been forced to resign and have taken other steps to, you know, either apologize or put in place changes at their companies or in their operations to make sure that they are basically friendly to female employees, Trump is today, made official that he is hiring somebody who is known, who has been accused of being an actual enabler of the rampant sexual harassment at Fox. And yes, Shine denies it, but there have been allegations, not just from one person, but from multiple women.
Well, and that he was ousted from Fox over this, but now is getting promoted to a plum position in the federal government.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's also coming at a time where these allegations against Trump aren't just in his past. He is currently being sued by one of his accusers here in New York court, Summer Zervos, who was on The Apprentice and says that she suffered severe sexual harassment by him, is suing him for defamation here. That's a case that's moving forward. The judge has allowed it to move forward. It has the potential to continue to basically keep this issue of the sexual misconduct allegations against him very much alive. And he's also dealing with the ongoing issues of Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. And so it's just interesting that this is a live issue for Trump. This isn't just in his past, and he's bringing in somebody who has been known to help basically powerful men cover up and deal with these allegations.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I think Megan's right too in terms of it being not only symbolic, but it's a signal too. I mean, I think it is again, and I think the point that you made earlier about Trump is more interested in the show than he is in any real agenda. All right, I mean, he has a couple of points that he's hit in terms of immigration and whatnot, but beyond that, I think really being able to lay claim to certain wins is more important than actually getting them. I mean, I think that even when you look at like what happened with North Korea, I think if he felt going there, if getting peace with North Korea was actually getting in the way of being able to declare that he had gotten peace with North Korea, right? Because it involves a lot of work that actually is painstaking. I think he would opt for the latter. And I think Bill Shine both has that expertise, right? But also signals that he is with those people.
And let me give Megan briefly the final word. I mean, you're talking about basically you have a head chef who's only interested in the menu, the words on the menu, and not what the actual food tastes like.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting that the symbolism is not lost on the women who did come forward with allegations of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct against these figures at Fox. Today, Gretchen Carlson, who, it was 2 years ago, I think today, that she filed a sexual harassment lawsuit against Roger Ailes. And she said the fact that Shine, who was seen as being one of these top enablers at Fox for the sexual harassment that was going on there, the fact that the announcement of his hiring was made today, 2 years later, she said the world works in mysterious ways, which I think is a generous way. I think a lot of these accusers see in this symbolism that it's a real sort of a slap in the face.
Well, and it goes to the undercurrents of the social movement that you've been reporting on, which is finding different places for pressure in the culture. The federal government, the Trump administration, not responsive, and yet corporate America, including even Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, more responsive than the federal government. So I think if you want change, there's both positive and negative notes within that. Megan, we'll be having you back, I'm sure. Megan Twohey and Sam Seder, thank you both. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.